the village of Zalanga, there lived a beautiful but sad princess named Lyra. She was the eldest of King Harrow and Queen Miri. Unlike her three younger sisters, who were already married, Lyra remained single. She was different from the others, not because of her heart or mind, but because of her size. Lyra was a large woman, and no matter how kind or graceful she was, no suitor ever came to ask for her hand in marriage. The people in the village would gossip behind her back, saying cruel things. "Have you heard? They need 3 pieces of clothes just to cover her waist," one woman whispered. Another laughed. "I heard she ate a whole goat by herself in one day." Lyra heard these whispers sometimes, and they stung. Her parents, King Harrow and Queen Miri, were worried about her. They had tried several times to arrange a marriage for Lyra, but every man they approached refused. Some said it was because of her size, others because they feared they couldn't keep up with her appetite. Lyra had given up on the idea of ever being married. "No one will ever want me for who I am," she told herself one night, lying in her bed, tears rolling down her face. "Even if someone does, it will only be because I'm a princess, not because they truly love me." But there was one thing that brought joy to her heart: dancing. Lyra was an incredible dancer, graceful and full of energy. However, she never danced in front of others. She was afraid they would mock her. Instead, she found hidden spots during festivals and danced where no one could see her. One day, as the villagers prepared for the grand annual festival, which was held with 3 neighboring villages, Lyra found herself thinking only of a secret dancing spot. The festival was filled with joy, music, and delicious food, but Lyra cared only about finding a quiet place to dance in peace. When the music started, she sneaked away and found a perfect hidden corner behind some trees near the river. As the drums began to beat, Lyra closed her eyes, a smile spreading across her face. She twirled and swayed, her body moving like water to the rhythm. She was free, at least for that moment. But soon she heard a strange sound. It was a different drum beat, louder and closer. Startled, she stopped dancing and turned around, only to see a man standing there, smiling at her, his hands moving skillfully across a drum. "Why did you stop dancing?" he asked, his smile wide and genuine. Lyra panicked. She was sure he was making fun of her. "Leave me alone!" she shouted, and without thinking, she began to run. But Lyra wasn't fast, and within moments, the man caught up to her. "Wait, please!" he called, holding up his hands. "I wasn't mocking you. I swear I wasn't." Lyra stopped, panting heavily. She turned to face him, her face red with both embarrassment and anger. "What do you want from me?" she demanded. Go laugh at someone else." The man's face softened. "I wasn't laughing," he said gently. "I saw you dancing and thought you were beautiful. I am a drummer, and I just wanted to play along with you." Lyra narrowed her eyes, unsure whether to believe him. She glanced at his clothes and noticed they were different from the ones people in her village wore. "You're not from here," she said, more as a statement than a question. The man shook his head. "No, I'm from the village of Lumara. My name is Jaro." "I'm Lyra," she said quietly. "Well, Lyra," Jaro said with a smile. "Thank you for letting me watch you dance. You're amazing." Lyra blushed, something she hadn't done in a long time. She wasn't used to compliments. Jara took a step closer. "Will you dance again? I can drum for you." Lyra hesitated, but then thought, what do I have to lose? He's just a stranger. He'll be gone soon. So with a deep breath, she nodded. Jaro grinned and began to drum. Slowly, at first, Lyra moved her hips to the beat, feeling more comfortable with each step. She danced, forgetting about the world, as Jaro watched her with admiration. After some time, she stopped and smiled shyly. "Thank you, Jaro," That was fun. Jarrell looked at her, his eyes full of warmth. It was my pleasure. Will you come back here tomorrow? Lyra felt her heart flutter. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wanted to say yes, but was afraid to hope. Maybe, she said quietly, before turning and walking away. That night, Lyra couldn't stop thinking about Jarrell. Why was he so kind to me? She wondered. He didn't even know who I was. But deep down, she felt a spark of hope. The next day, she returned to the same spot by the river, unsure if Jarrell would be there. But when she arrived, he was already waiting for her. His face lit up when he saw her. I was afraid you wouldn't come, he said, his voice full of excitement. Lyra smiled. I wasn't sure if I should, she admitted. I'm glad you did, Jarrell said softly, stepping closer to her. I want to get to know you, Lyra. They sat by the river talking for hours. Jarrell told her about his village, Lumara, and how he loved playing the drums at festivals. Lyra told him about her love for dancing, but she didn't mention the gossip or her struggles with her body. She didn't want to spoil the happy mood. As the sun began to set, Jarrell picked up his drum again. Shall we? He asked, smiling. Lyra laughed softly and stood up, ready to dance. Once again, she lost herself in the rhythm as Jarrell played for her. For the first time in a long while, Lyra felt free. Days turned into weeks, and Jarrell and Lyra continued meeting in secret by the river. Every time they met, they grew closer. Their conversations became deeper, and Lyra found herself opening up to Jarrell in ways she hadn't expected. He never once made her feel bad about herself. In fact, he made her feel special. One evening, as they sat by the river after dancing, Jarrell took Lyra's hand in his. Lyra, he said, his voice serious. There's something I've been wanting to tell you. Lyra's heart began to race. What is it? She asked, though she had a feeling she knew. I love you, Jarrell said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. I've loved you from the moment I saw you dance. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had hoped for this, but now it was happening, she didn't know what to say. Jarrell, I don't know what to say, she stammered. You don't have to say anything, Jarrell said, smiling warmly. Just tell me how you feel. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then finally let herself speak the truth. I love you too, Jarrell. Jarrell's face lit up with joy. I want to marry you, Lyra. I want to go to your father and ask for your hand in marriage. Lyra's heart soared. For the first time in her life, she felt truly wanted. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll marry you. They embraced, holding each other tightly. But as they planned their future together, something neither of them could control was about to change everything. A week before Jarrell was supposed to come to Lyra's village to ask for her hand in marriage, disaster struck. A deadly illness spread throughout the villages, including Zalanga and Lumara. The sickness was fast and vicious, and many people fell ill. The village leaders ordered everyone to stay in their home to prevent the disease from spreading. Lyra was heartbroken. She could no longer meet Jarrell by the river. Worse, a few days after the borders were closed, Lyra herself became sick. For weeks, she battled the illness. It was a terrible time, and Lyra felt weaker with each passing day. She could barely eat, and her body, once large and strong, began to shrink. She lost weight rapidly, and by the time the herbalists found a cure for the disease, Lyra was unrecognizable. When she finally recovered, Lyra looked at herself in the mirror and gasped. She was thin, thinner than she had ever been. Her face had changed, her body had changed, and she no longer looked like the Lyra she had known all her life. As she walked through the village, people stared at her, but not in the way they used to. Now, men who had once ignored her suddenly smiled and greeted her. They complimented her beauty, something they had never done before. Lyra couldn't believe it. Is this all it takes? She thought bitterly. A little weight loss, and suddenly I'm worth something. Weeks passed, and Lyra became more and more admired in the village. Men who had once whispered cruel jokes about her size now vied for her attention. Some of the wealthiest men in the village came to her father asking to marry her. Lyra had gone from being invisible to being the most desired woman in Zalanga. But something inside her had changed. As the attention from other men grew, Lyra began to think less of Jarrell. Why should I settle for him when I can have anyone I want? She thought. She had convinced herself that Jaro only liked her when she was larger, and now that she was different, she deserved someone better, someone with status and wealth. One day, she finally decided to break things off with Jaro. She hadn't seen him since before the illness, and now that the borders had reopened, she returned to their secret spot by the river to meet him. When Jaro saw her, his face lit up with happiness. "Lyra, I've missed you so much," he said, rushing toward her. But Lyra didn't smile. She stood still, her arms crossed. "Jaro, we need to talk." Jaro stopped in his tracks, sensing something was wrong. "What's the matter?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "I've changed," Lyra said coldly. "I'm not the same person I was before." Jaro looked confused. "Of course you've changed. You were sick, and now you're well. But what does that have to do with us?" Lyra shook her head. "I don't think we should be together anymore. I've had a lot of time to think, and we're not a good match." Jaro's face fell. "What are you saying, Lyra? We love each other. You promised to marry me." "I've changed my mind," Lyra said sharply. "You and we're too different. I deserve more." "More?" Jaro's voice cracked. What does that even mean? I've always loved you, no matter what." "That's the problem," Lyra said, her voice cold and distant. "You loved me when I was different, but now I have more options. I don't need to settle." Jaro stood there, stunned, as Lyra turned her back on him and walked away. He called after her, but she didn't stop. She didn't even look back. After breaking things off with Jaro, Lyra became even more popular in the village. Wealthy men from neighboring villages came to ask for her hand in marriage. Lyra enjoyed the attention, but none of the suitors truly captured her heart. They all seemed to want her for her newfound beauty, just as Jaro had once wanted her for who she truly was. One day, Lyra decided to host a grand competition, a wrestling contest for all the eligible men in the village. The winner, she declared, would become her husband. The news spread quickly, and many men signed up, eager to win the hand of the most beautiful woman in Zelanga. Meanwhile, Lyra prepared for the event by indulging in all the luxuries she could afford. She spent months receiving beauty treatments, trying to maintain the slim figure she had gained after her illness. But what Lyra didn't realize was that her old habits had returned. She was eating more and more each day, and slowly, the weight she had lost began to return. By the time the day of the competition arrived, Lyra had regained almost all of the weight she had lost during her illness. She tried to hide her disappointment, but deep down, she knew she wasn't the same slender figure she had been just months ago. On the day of the wrestling competition, the village of Zelanga was buzzing with excitement. The event had drawn attention from all the neighboring villages, and men from near and far had come to prove their strength for a chance to win Princess Lyra's hand in marriage. The crowd gathered in the village square, eagerly waiting for the beautiful princess who had been the talk of the region ever since her transformation. Lyra, despite her own nervousness, had spent the morning preparing herself. She had hoped to keep her newfound size hidden, but as she dressed and looked at herself in the mirror, she couldn't deny that her body had returned to its former shape. Her months of indulgence had brought her back to the size she had been before the illness. Her heart sank as she realized that the admiration she had received would soon disappear. Still, she put on her best royal attire and stepped out to greet the crowd, hoping a title as princess would be enough to maintain the interest of the suitors. As she approached the square, the noise of the excited crowd suddenly died down. There was a hush, and all eyes turned to her. The men who had come to compete for her hand stared at her in disbelief. This was not the slender, graceful woman they had heard stories about. This was not the woman they had imagined. One by one, the suitors began to murmur among themselves. A few turned and walked away, shaking their heads in disappointment. Others left without a word, unwilling to compete for the princess who no longer matched their ideal image. Lyra stood there, feeling the weight of their stares, her face flushing with humiliation. She had never felt so alone. The dream she had built for herself, the fantasy of being adored and desired, were crumbling right in front of her eyes. As she was about to turn and leave the square in shame, something caught her eye. Among the crowd, standing quietly and watching her, was a man she hadn't expected to see, Jaro. He looked different. His clothes were finely tailored, made of luxurious fabrics that were clearly fit for someone of noble birth. He no longer wore the simple, rough garments he had worn when they met by the river. For a moment, Lyra froze. She could hardly believe her eyes. Jaro, the humble drummer she had once danced with in secret, was now dressed like royalty. As their eyes met, Lyra felt a deep pang of regret wash over her. Jaro didn't look at her with disappointment or anger, but with a quiet sadness, as if he already knew what had transpired between them was over. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, a voice called out from behind them, "My prince, it is time to leave," a tall, dignified man said, bowing slightly. The words hit Lyra like a thunderbolt. "My prince?" She blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. Jaro was a prince? Suddenly, everything began to make sense. The simple clothes, the way he had never mentioned his status, how he had always acted like a commoner. He had hidden his true identity all along. But why? Before she could gather her thoughts, Jaro took a step toward her, his face filled with emotions she could no longer read. There was sadness, yes, but also a calm acceptance of what had happened between them. "Lyra," her voice trembling, called out. "Jaro, wait. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you hide who you are?" Jaro stopped and turned to face her fully. The square was still, all eyes on the exchange between the princess and the prince disguised as a commoner. "I didn't tell you, Lyra, because I didn't want you to see me as a prince," Jaro began, his voice steady but filled with an undertone of sadness. "I wanted you to see me as just Jaro, the man who loved you for who you were. Not for your title, not for how you looked, but for you." Lyra's heart sank as she listened to his words. She had been so focused on appearances, on status, that she had failed to see the truth. Jaro had loved her for the person she truly was, long before her transformation. "But why hide it?" she asked, her voice shaky. Why pretend to be a commoner?" Jaro's gaze softened. "I've always felt trapped by my title, by the expectations of being a prince. Everywhere I went, people treated me differently because of my royal blood. I never knew if they liked me for who I was or for the power I represented. When I came to Zalanga, I wanted to escape that. I wanted to be free, even if just for a little while." He took a deep breath, then continued. "When I met you by the river, I didn't see a princess. I didn't see a woman the village mocked for her size. I saw someone who danced with joy, who had a spirit that couldn't be broken. I saw the real Lyra, and I fell in love with her." Tears welled up in Lyra's eyes. She had pushed away the one person who had seen her beyond the surface, who had cherished her for who she was, not for what she looked like or the title she carried. "And what did I do?" Lyra whispered, her voice cracking. I let it all go. I chose those who only cared about my appearance. I thought I was too good for you." Jaro looked at her with a sad smile. "You made your choice, Lyra, and I understand. You've always been more than enough. But now, our paths are different." The silence in the square was deafening. The crowd watched as Lyra stood there, tears streaming down her face, unable to find the words to make things right. Jaro turned to leave, his footsteps slow and deliberate. His father, the king of Lumara, was waiting for him. Just before Jaro disappeared into the crowd, he looked back one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Goodbye, Lyra," he said softly, and then he was gone. Lyra stood frozen, her heart breaking. She realized too late that she had lost something precious, something she could never replace. The love of a man who had seen her at her worst and still found her worthy of his heart. As she watched Jaro leave, she knew that the life she had dreamed of, one filled with love and happiness, was now beyond her reach. She had let it slip away, blinded by vanity and pride. Lyra never saw Jaro again after that day. She tried to reach out to him, sending messages to his village, but he never responded. She knew she had lost him forever. Years passed, and Lyra's chances of finding true love faded. She settled for becoming the 10th wife of an old chief, a man who saw her only as a trophy, not as a person. Every night, Lyra lay awake thinking of Jaru, the man who had loved her without judgment, the man she had pushed away. She realized too late that she had given up on something rare and precious, something she could never get back. And so, Lyra lived out her days in regret, always wondering what could have been.